So here we are, Acid Horizon Podcast Live. It's me, Craig, with Devin Gouré, and we are in where?
We're in East Frank Superette in Kitchen in Monroe, North Carolina.
And what is the significance of this place in particular?
This is my hometown at the moment. Not where I grew up, but where I currently live. Yeah, it's a bit south of Charlotte. Nice little town. I particularly like the atmosphere here. Fun little place that often holds drag shows and other kinds of shows.
So anyway, today we decided to do an episode impromptu as I was traveling through Charlotte, North Carolina, and we thought what a great episode it would be if we talked about the 5 misconceptions, or 5 among many misconceptions that people hold about the philosophy or the man Friedrich Nietzsche. And Devin is going to be along for the ride today, and he's going to explain Nietzsche to you. So the first concept that we're going to get into right now is the will to power. And so Nietzsche is often reduced to the idea that the aim of life is to maximize power, and it's often understood that power is domination, expansion, or control over others. And we should, as human beings, reject any drive or any values that limits that drive to power. What is it, in your opinion, that Nietzsche actually believes about the will to power?
Yeah, I think much of the impression that Nietzsche is a thinker who defends the view that might makes right, or is, say, a modern-day version of Callicles and Thrasymachus and Plato. Much of this, I think, comes from the Antichrist and some of the passages there where Nietzsche is particularly explicit. What is called good is anything that causes power to increase. What is called bad is anything that weakens. And this is a case where Nietzsche states things much more unconditionally than he does elsewhere. When we actually look at what his concept of will to power is doing, things start to look more complicated. So to give a bit of background here, Nietzsche starts referring to this concept of desire for power, or Machtgefühl, feeling of power. Earlier in his work, sometime in the middle period, Human, All Too Human, and Daybreak. Will to power in his published work first appears in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And particularly there, it's drawing a contrast between will to power and the will to life. And this is the of self-overcoming passage or chapter in Zarathustra. And Nietzsche sees the kind of Darwinian concept of a will to life, or say a desire to survive or instinct to survive, as something like a contradiction in terms. As he puts it, how can we desire or will life if we already have life? For Nietzsche, it's internal to the will as a concept that it creates beyond itself, right? The will is as a kind of faculty, something that comes out of us and reaches beyond towards some object or towards some kind of aim that we create. But importantly, I think, as Craig, as you mentioned, kind of the aim of all life, will to power is not some intentional psychological act for Nietzsche, nor is it really some fact about empirical psychology, say human beings happen to desire power and want to accumulate it. It is really an overall theory about how life functions through a kind of struggle of forces and an ongoing effort that is not conscious or intentional in any way to expand life's capacity for acting in the world. Let's dig into that a little bit further. So the concept of will to power, what it ultimately states is that any force or any kind of source of power inherently exercises itself to the absolute limit of its capacity. This tendency, this kind of pathos to overcome, to exert power, is something like a brute automatic fact about life, right? So it's prior to any kind of psychological desire to accumulate power, any project or intention of accumulating power. And in fact, Nietzsche in many cases will argue that those kinds of projects do not really express the kind of will to power that they purport to. One good example is a passage on the feeling of power in The Gay Science towards the beginning of book 1, where Nietzsche argues that actually the desire to represent power to others, to kind of show how powerful one is really a kind of reactive instinct of weakness. It is some kind of, the kind of classic argument that arises out of some kind of internal insecurity that is an attempt to compensate for that. In fact, the very presence of this conscious project interrupts what is really the kind of smooth and automatic functioning of will to power. Now, where do we get these ideas of domination, exploitation, appropriation that are often attached to will to power? Well, part of the idea here is that when we imagine the will to power as always exerting itself, exerting force to its maximum, it can only do so against some kind of resistance. So the will to power does not simply act upon the world, but it always acts against some kind of resistance that aims to overcome or naturally kind of tends to overcome, right? So resistance exerts itself against the will, against a certain force, right? That force is not yet adequate to overcome that resistance. And what that force will do at that point is accumulate power, expand its capacity for acting until it can overcome and incorporate that kind of resistance. This kind of tendency is how Nietzsche sees life in general functioning. In fact, you can make the argument that in certain cases, both in Beyond Good and Evil and as well as in Unpublished Notes, Nietzsche actually wants to generalize this mechanism to physical causality in general in the universe. But suffice it to say, the idea here is domination arises from kind of this natural friction of will to power, right? For Nietzsche, he sees this as a kind of fact of life, and that all life exerts itself through this tendency to expand, and thus a tendency to overcome and incorporate resistance. But there are myriad ways in which this happens, right? Precisely because this is everything life does is a manifestation of will to power. It is true that domination, explicit domination and appropriation express such a will, but it is also true that artistic creation can express such a will. It is true that the will to knowledge represents the will to power. In fact, we'll even see that the slave revolt in Morals, the attempt to reverse morality and exalt compassion and pity, is itself a manifestation of a kind of will to power, is itself an attempt to master some other force in a kind of conflict. So again, what we get wrong, I think what people mostly get wrong is that a idea of the will to power is centered on some kind of subject. You or me, a consciousness who engages in an intentional project to desire and accumulate power. And that is definitely not what Nietzsche is.
Well, then maybe just a quick follow-up, practical ethical question then. What if one were to acknowledge in oneself that one's drive to a certain kind of power involves either domination or a deep desire for recognition that might ultimately be undermining of their pursuit of joy or happiness? How does one put to work these ideas?
Yeah, I think about it sometimes. I've thought about it as like the Raskolnikov problem. Like, what if you're, as in Raskolnikov, the main character in Crime and Punishment, who, murders his landlady because essentially to see, what it's like to kind of experience the power of having murdered someone, right? So what if we imagine a human being who simply naturally desires to dominate, right? Experiences some kind of gratification or joy in that. Are we supposed to sort of praise, do we see that kind of actual action as praiseworthy for Nietzsche? And I would argue that this gets everything the wrong way around, right? You're still trapped within a kind of perspective of traditional morality where, again, we have subjects with free wills that are choosing to act in a certain way, right? And then we praise or blame that action. But Nietzsche is going to deny that entire picture of human action, right? So he will say, yes, there are entities, most entities, some entities, whatever, that may feel compelled by their will to power to exercise domination, exploitation. In fact, he will at times say that taking joy in cruelty is a certain feature of life, and one that he says were particularly important for early human societies. But at the same time, Nietzsche will also make the argument that throughout his work, that much of what we see as explicit domination is a product in some way of this mistaken psychology, right? So he will unmask in kind of hidden forms of domination, hidden forms of cruelty within Christianity, right, that are masked behind a kind of morality of compassion. That in many ways for him derive from an inability to tolerate the fact that life inherently involves this kind of power struggle, this kind of conflict for domination, right? Nietzsche's alternative ethic, if we look at the idea of amor fati or the eternal return, it will push towards the direction of accepting necessity. And what the broader argument that he will make is, yes, accepting necessity will mean reconciling ourselves in some way to the inevitability of certain forms of domination and power, even cruelty in this world. On the other hand, it also involves recognizing that so much of what we value in life, and so much of what we value in morality, great love, even great compassion, the desire to sacrifice oneself for others, these also come from a vibrant will to power, right? These also come from this creative need to overcome and to expand. So much of Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality then is to say that this kind of Christian command morality also cuts off the sources of what is really valuable in the moral life. It doesn't just cut off joys in domination, it also cuts off the joys of creation. It also cuts off the joys of human connection and love. And this is the kind of picture that Nietzsche is trying to reorient us towards. It's not just inverting, exercising power good, compassion, pity bad. It's not just inverting traditional morality. It's an entire reframing of our picture of human action and agency.
Okay. Well, the next question is then on slave revolt and morality. So in Nietzsche's work on the genealogy of morality, which I know you're doing some work on now, he seems far more critical of slave morality than of master morality, which has led some readers to believe that he's blaming the oppressed rather than questioning domination. What's going on there?
Yeah. So I posted a little thread on this recently because I wanted to pick out one of the what I take to be the crucial move that Nietzsche makes in the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals. For those who are not familiar with the text, it's 3 different essays that each kind of study a different version of the kind of pathologies within Christian morality. The first is specifically on resentment. And Nietzsche will argue that the key to slave morality and key to resentment is that it involves what he calls a reversal of the evaluating gaze. So what he admires in a kind of earlier aristocratic morality is that it posits some value as essentially, it affirms some value in this world as good, as worthy, and only secondarily then draws a contrast with those who lack this positive value, right? Slave morality for him reverses this. What it does is first identifies some kind of evil enemy that it then reacts upon, right? It identifies the enemy as evil and therefore concludes that I, the slave, must be good. And in the process also misrepresents the nature of that enemy. It represents the enemy as having, again, this free will, this kind of centered intentional subjectivity, and is therefore choosing to engage in domination and cruelty rather than being impelled by a kind of will to power. But as I mentioned previously, this position is very complicated because slave morality itself, the slave revolt and morals, is also an expression of the will to power, which raises an interesting question. Why is it that Nietzsche values, on what grounds, let's say, can Nietzsche praise master morality in these early, say, passages of the genealogy? And I believe it's the 6th section, it might be a 6th or 7th of this essay, where he pauses and says, well, what are you complaining about? Or as a hypothetical interlocutor, kind of say, well, what are you complaining about? Slave morality 1, right? Doesn't that in effect mean that slave morality is the new master morality? Well, part of the reason why Nietzsche thinks it's not is this psychological reversal that takes place, right? He wants to say that this deepening of the human subject by projecting action back onto some will that's internal is the only thing really that makes human history interesting, but has dominated essentially the last 2 millennia of human history to create a psychology that is rooted in guilt, asceticism, denial of this world, denial of the body, denial of the passions, and everything else that for Nietzsche is kind of essential to immanent joy in this life. And importantly, I think it's not necessarily, this is not an unequivocal negative picture. I think that the passages that people should read are not just in the genealogy, but in the Antichrist, where Nietzsche gives a bit more detail about the slave revolt and morals, and he particularly locates it in the Babylonian captivity. So make the argument that the nation of Israel early on had a more sort of natural relationship to its God. So the God of Israel was the God of a people that ensured their power, ensured their victory and prosperity, right? And he sees this as a kind of straightforward, relatively natural form of religion. It's later in the Babylonian captivity where that God proves impotent in some fashion, right? Unable to free the Israelites from this new enslavement. And it is then that the reversal occurs where a priestly class arrogates itself power to undermine those conquerors who are currently ruling. And the thing that Nietzsche particularly objects to in this priestly class's move is the way it falsifies certain aspects of reality, right? It falsifies this world by presenting all power as essentially negative, by promising later on when it develops into Christianity, by promising rewards in the afterlife and some other beyond rather than in this world. But he is, at the same time, admires this ingenuity, right? It is one of the distinctive forms of what he sees as the will to power of the Jewish people, right? If we, accept that Nietzsche often does talk in kind of generalized terms about races and groups that are, we can discuss the problems there. But there's no doubt that he admires this kind of ingenuity, as it were. He sees it once again as a move in a power struggle, but one that has terrible consequences because of the way it ultimately falsifies reality. So again, it's a much more complicated picture, in part because we can't escape slave morality. That is what we've inherited. That's what's baked into us as a kind of second nature. There is no simple way of returning to master morality.
Sure. Now, the big question is the Ubermensch, the Superman, one of the biggest concepts in Nietzsche's oeuvre. And clearly, these are successful individuals, billionaires, political strongmen, the ruling elite, right?
Right, obviously the aristocrats of today's society, who Nietzsche, as we know, during his time, had no criticisms whatsoever of those who had achieved fame and political power, right? Famously a fan of Bismarck. And really, if you look even in early texts like the Untimely Meditations, he's taking shots at those who present themselves as the moral exemplars of their time, right? And arguing once again, as will be consistent throughout his work, that real virtue really lies with the untimely ones, right? Those who exist kind of in and against their time for the sake of another. But to focus more specifically on the Übermensch, again, another concept that really first appears in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and readers will recognize that appears right at the beginning in Zarathustra's prologue, where he descends into the marketplace to teach the overman and is eventually rejected. Later on, Nietzsche will make kind of scattered comments about the Ubermensch, even though Zarathustra is really the main textual site that the concept is developed. A couple are particularly interesting. So one is that he will, on occasion, talk about Ubermensch and the concept of the Ubermensch as a type of humanity that might exist in the future. Now, importantly, Nietzsche does not think that new type of humanity exists in his time, nor do I think he would think it exists in our time, right? It can only be the product of this transvaluation of values that will have to kind of pass through a stark confrontation with nihilism, the death of God, the kind of absence of moral meaning in this world, right? And this new type of human being would be one that is capable of passing this test of the eternal return. So can you will that your life in all of its detail recur infinitely as exactly the same as it was? Can you experience enough joy in this world that you would be able to pass that test and will the eternal return of your life despite suffering? The Ubermensch would essentially signify a new type of humanity that is capable of that pure kind of immanent joy in life. Now, he sees intimations of the Ubermensch in particular human beings. Napoleon is probably the clearest example. However, Nietzsche will describe Napoleon not as an Ubermensch, but as a fascinating combination of the superhuman and the inhuman. That is, there is still a significant degree of the inhuman in Napoleon that does not yet reach beyond to the superhuman fully, right? In this way, again, he's continually presenting this as something in the future. And for this reason, I think to conclude this question, to return to Zarathustra, which again is where the main discussion is, we can see early on that the overman enters into a particular symbolic tray that is laid out at the beginning of Zarathustra, right? There is consistently a play between heights and depths, over and under, right? Zarathustra starts out atop his mountain, coming out from the cave, seeing the sun that rises from the depths and then descends into the depths. And then he offers the metaphor that he too will have to go down to humanity and teach them the overman. Now again, overman is paired with this concept of going under. Man is something that is to be overcome. Man must go under so that the overman can be. In each of these cases, this play of over and under, of heights and depths, invokes the image of some kind of ideal that is higher than humanity, right? That which we place over man, right? And in this sense, the Ubermensch, above all, before it is an individual, before it's a class of individual, is this metaphor for the process of value, of creating values, and is a test of what conditions must be presupposed to truly give birth to some new goal or some new ideal for humanity. And in this sense, the Ubermensch is a figure of that goal. That goal doesn't exist yet. It is Nietzsche's aim, not even necessarily to present that goal. He believes he has done so in Zarathustra, but later feels that it is his mission, as it were, to kind of disrupt or accelerate the decline of a decadent European bourgeois culture so that eventually that affirmative vision can emerge.
If we had to whittle down the concept of the Ubermensch to a practical maxim or a singular question that we would ask ourselves on the daily, what might it be?
I think that the image that comes to mind is the child at play, right? The Aeon of Heraclitus, who of course Nietzsche credits with kind of having an early intimation of the eternal return. The third metamorphosis in Zarathustra, first is the camel, second is the lion, and third is the child. The child represents this position of innocence towards all of existence, right? The finally freeing of the weight of the spirit of gravity that weighs down existence with guilt and moral significance, right? And rising above that to the level of a child at play. So that is ultimately, the child at play is the real image of the Ubermensch, not the strong man, who more represents the lion in this metamorphosis, right?
Great. Let's move on. Nietzsche, fascism, and what he calls the great politics. Nietzsche is frequently associated with political thinkers whose ideas prefigure European fascism. Look, we're talking about Napoleon here today, and that's why he's often cited by right-wing ideologues. And how legitimate do you think that association is, or where does the right wing fundamentally misread Nietzsche?
Well, let me start by saying that I have no interest in resolving or neutralizing what is dangerous about Nietzsche's thought, right? When Beyond Good and Evil was reviewed as a dangerous book after it came out, Nietzsche kept that review and was very happy about it, right? And what that highlights is Nietzsche's status as a provocateur of some kind, right? We always have to keep in mind that Nietzsche is never telling us straightforwardly, very rarely telling us straightforwardly what his view is. He will sometimes, but most of the time is wielding rhetoric to incite, to offend, to provoke, because that is what jolts us out of the complacency of this kind of existence of bourgeois democratic equality and mediocrity we've kind of fallen into. And I would also say, importantly, Nietzsche, Zarathustra, tells us that we need to go our own way, right? That only once we have rejected him can we return to him. So these are the elements that rightly cause someone like Walter Kaufmann to associate Nietzsche with an individualistic ethos, right? That reading has been overstated, but at the same time, it's important to emphasize that cuts against certainly any institutionalized state or worship of the state, for which he has nothing but disdain in Zarathustra in particular. His long screed against the state in Zarathustra. So that's the first thing. Nonetheless, if we want to talk about Nietzsche's concept of great politics in particular, I think it's important to have some historical context. In the context of Germany in the 1870s and 1880s, the rise of the German Empire and the kind of intense movement of German nationalism and militarism around Bismarck is really the environment that he's responding to with this concept of great politics. The contrast of great politics is what he sometimes refers to as Bismarck's petty politics. This is a politics of strategic maneuvering centered around the kind of position of the nation state, right? Nietzsche, importantly, is not a defender of nationalism. So one of an essential moment for Nietzsche, again in this context, is the period right after the Franco-Prussian War, right? So Nietzsche enters the Franco-Prussian War as pretty much a good German nationalist, right? And he's not only horrified by what he sees, just the violence of the war that he witnesses, but he is also struck by one key issue, which is that the German military victory over France does not, in his mind, amount to a cultural victory of Germany over France. And what he sees in the rising tide of German nationalism under Bismarck is a retreat from any possibility of Germany taking the reins of creating a truly pan-European culture, right? Something that truly integrates the entire legacy of the Renaissance, in particular, some aspects of the Enlightenment, but can potentially salvage this from what he sees as the kind of Christian, also revolutionary tradition in modernity. Again, putting Nietzsche's politics on the table here. What we get then is Nietzsche's in a very peculiar place, right? Nietzsche is unequivocal in his rejection of certain core aspects of what would become fascist politics in Germany. Right? Any idea of organizing life around this strong state will run up against Nietzsche's strong political skepticism. Any narrow nationalistic ideology, particularly a racialist one that is centered around some idea of the pure race, will run up against Nietzsche's idea that we need a pan-European ruling class, right? That has to be, and again, we will talk about breeding, right? But he will talk about race mixing. He will talk about, different kind of experiments and creating this kind of new, right? And all of this isn't, and I think important for me to say, I'm not interested in somehow defending Nietzsche's politics. This is part of the point of keeping him as a dangerous thinker. But what Nietzsche is objecting to is the kind of narrow nationalism of his time and imperialism that would eventually culminate in World War I, right? So Nietzsche, I think, it's kind of the other function of great politics. It functions as a prediction, right? It functions as Nietzsche's description of what he sees as the fate of this nationalist and imperialist jockeying for power in Europe, right? Which will eventually culminate in wars such as the Earth has never seen, right? And I think you can raise a legitimate question as well, to what extent is Nietzsche's counter ideal a fascist one, right? I think there's certainly no shortage of evidence that suggests this in Nietzsche's work. It's just that there is probably even more evidence that suggests various other conclusions, suggests not only that Nietzsche would have rejected a fascist politics, but that his vision of great politics is not one that's centered in those wars, but centered in some overcoming of them, right? A point where we have moved beyond the necessity of those wars. So again, I think that it's important to situate this idea of great politics as Nietzsche's kind of account of Bismarck, the nation, the rise of the German state under Bismarck. And it is a dangerous concept, right? But it is one that raises this issue of what is the legacy of Europe coming out of Renaissance? Like, what is the legacy of this entire, civilizational creation of what results in liberal democracy that we've inherited now? What is its kind of destiny and how can it still be shaped? So.
I mean, it's easy to say that history repeats itself, especially with what we're seeing today, not only in the United States, but in parts of Europe and even in Asia now with the rise of far-right governments. And here in the United States in particular, what we are seeing is an increase in hegemonic power as an antidote for what people see as cultural decline.
Yes. Yeah.
And layered on top of that, of course, is the spectacle surrounding the MAGA movement, Charlie Kirk, and everything else besides. You yourself had said that you believe, with your revolutionary view of politics, that it is important to take what Nietzsche says and cultivate a culture within that revolutionary movement.
Correct.
Which, but in my opinion, does not seem to be happening in the right. They're using the hegemonic power plus the spectacle as a surrogate for cultural transformation.
Yes.
But how does one effectuate that possibility? Politically speaking, culturally speaking?
So I guess there are a couple things come to mind. So the first is what I think everybody on the left can pretty easily see how much this right-wing movement is driven by resentment in exactly the Nietzschean sense, right? There is a sense of grievance. There's a sense of loss of status, right? Some kind of status that was they rightfully previously held, whether it's the white racial status, patriarchal male status, there are any number you can list here. This results in a grievance politics that forces them to identify some kind of enemy to which we impute a specific intentional action of stealing, some kind of higher culture from them, corrupting it, right? Which is why this goes hand in hand with conspiracy theories so easily. And what the overwhelming sense you get is that none of these people, whether it's the Curtis Yarvins of the world or the Andrew Tates of the world or whatever else, really look at anything like those that Nietzsche describes in the genealogy as men who come like lightning, right? And who exert their power on creating and defining the world in this innocent, unproblematic way, not with grievances and resentment towards people who they feel have infringed upon their power. And I think in particular, Nietzsche left no doubt that the Ubermensch type can only emerge through a full confrontation with nihilism in the direction of some kind of higher affirmation of life, right? Which is presented in The Eternal Return in Zarathustra. Where I would situate the right wing today is among the figures that Nietzsche calls active nihilists in Will to Power, right? So his idea with active nihilism is that we have a phase of passive nihilism. This is kind of exemplified by the last man in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, right? This kind of complacent ho-hum, I'm happy with the contentment offered to me by bourgeois consumerist civilization, etc. This kind of corruption would eventually give way to active nihilism, right? Which is a will to negate and abolish these kind of older values, right? But in essentially every way, that active nihilism is still fully determined by the morality that it rejects, right? It reacts against what is conventionally praised as good, right? And wills what is identified by that same tradition as evil. This is sort of the vice signaling that people, I think, have begun to talk about. The idea that the cruelty is the point. Performing cruelty comes not, it is again not this unproblematic, I inflict cruelty because it's impelled in the moment and then I move on and maybe I'm sorry, right? That would be what the Ubermensch does because he has a short memory. Instead, what we get is the idea that we should act essentially in the exact opposite of the way that is recommended by people who purport to be virtuous and moral, right? We should assume that the people who are virtue signaling are hypocritical and therefore we will opt for vice signaling instead. This is an intermediate period, right, that Nietzsche would try to, I think, was trying to bring about to some extent, but not for its own sake, but so that it could clear away the detritus of old desiccated idols, as it were, old hollow idols, and pave the way for this kind of new childhood, which leads to your other question, how is it that, we go about cultivating this? I think that if you are a Nietzschean with this kind of sensibility, then you do not see the struggle to forge, let's say, class consciousness or the consciousness of some kind of new revolutionary class or movement as something that can be taken for granted, either as a product of mere political organizing or as a product of somehow the necessary forces of history, right, in the classic Marxist tradition. I think we're in an interesting moment where a lot of people who are staunch materialists are coming around to grappling with the extreme nihilism of the far right today that we've just been discussing, and realizing that something more, a battle on this kind of moral terrain, the terrain of values, might actually be necessary, right? And for some people, this means a revival of humanistic morality. But from the Nietzschean standpoint, this would mean kind of rising to the moment of trying to create a new, say, political counterculture for the sake of this higher ideal, right? And I think we've talked about before. This is a struggle that has to occur in the terrain of politics, in the sense that liberalism, with its kind of refusal to offer a vision of the good life, unified culture, has left a kind of vacuum that is now being filled by fascist, ideologies, right? But I don't think the left can afford to cede that space anymore, right? Whether it's a religious space, whether it's a moral space, Nietzsche talks to us at a different register, which is why I think readings that try to reduce him to a political thinker are just kind of absurd.
Yeah.
I do think what he would suggest is we need to entertain the idea of some kind of broader cultural and religious and ethical transformation and how we bring that about rather than just political organization. I know this will sound anathema to many people on the left. I feel like I'm pretty consistent about this as my Nietzschean perspective. I think against the rising tide of fascism, I do not think we can simply adopt either, electoral politics or straightforward class politics. There has to be some kind of existential tragic ethos that has to be built.
The last big question is on race, hierarchy, and breeding. Nietzsche's language around breeding, rank, higher types has led many of his readers once again back to the assumption that, well, maybe he's not only a right-wing thinker, but into racial hierarchy, proto-eugenics. How are we to understand his views on race or breeding, which you acknowledge are kind of strange?
Yeah. So let's again start with the kernel of truth. Nietzsche was familiar with Galton's work, ironically introduced to Galton by his sister, as one might expect, the paradigmatic proto-fascist. This was late, I think, 1885, I want to say. The reason to note that, though, is that I think we're going to map Nietzsche onto contemporary debates about eugenics, right? We have to first start by recognizing that Nietzsche is operating with different assumptions. Modern genetics has not been established yet. He is operating with archaic kind of ideas of heredity that I think were accepted by a number of people at his time, right? So does Nietzsche have some version of race realism? Yes, I think he has some version of that, right? Yeah. Is it consistent? First of all, is it consistent, right? Does he actually stick to the same does he actually have an essentializing view of this kind of race realism, or is it more of a dynamic and interactive one? I would say it's a dynamic interactive one. But also it's one that does not map, I think, at all onto the picture of, Aryan or Anglo-Saxon superiority you get from the far right today. So Nietzsche is actually going to argue for quite the opposite. First of all, he wants to, when he talks about breeding, he's going to talk about the breeding of a new ruling class for Europe that is going to be bred largely from the cultures that are at the periphery of Europe, Russians and Jews, for example, right? Again, encouraging racial mixing, encouraging the incorporation, because for Nietzsche, and I think this is the point, the concept of the order of rank operates on different registers, right? So there are cases like in Beyond Good and Evil, for example, the opening passage of What is Noble. He will explicitly talk about the rank order and the pathos of distance as having to do with caste hierarchy, right? At other times, though, he's going to apply it to two different things. One, the concept of moral determination, right? That we have to have a rank order of goods, or else there is no way of kind of ordering our moral judgments, right? And he's also going to talk about it as a rank ordering within the soul, a rank ordering of different drives and different faculties. And if he values the rank order of caste, it is because he thinks it makes possible the creation of this manifold richness of the soul eventually, right? So this is Nietzsche's challenge, right? Anytime he is advocating for slavery, for example, like an early essay in the Greek state, Nietzsche has this view that he's interested in cultivating the conditions in which true greatness and human value are possible, right? And he does think that human life cannot but slide into nihilism and world denial if it lacks those kinds of resources of greatness and beauty, right? But his view of how we get there is radically different from any kind of fascist one, right? He's again advocating for a kind of racial mixing. He is offering different accounts of different. So, for example, in the infamous discussion of the blonde beast in the genealogy, Celts are included, Arabs are included, Japanese are included. In each of these cases, Nietzsche is extracting certain like noetic qualities from different population, cultural, racial groupings, right? That he sees as feeding into this kind of new human type. And if he values this, it's not because he's trying to create a homogenized, pure race. Far from it. He's trying to essentially collect in the European spirit as many conflicting affects and impulses as possible. That is what he actually values in the kind of multiculturalism, as it were, of Europe at this time. It creates this tension of the bow in which there's such manifold conflicting impulses within a culture that it has that chaos to give birth to an endless star. So I would argue, yes, it's quite the opposite. It's not that Nietzsche doesn't have problematic views on this, but it cuts in the direction of some kind of synthesized pan-European culture. It incorporates praise for the elements of mixing cultures, and it also doesn't seem to really take an essentialist approach to race as a general. So I think this is an area where Nietzsche has. It's not that he doesn't give reason for us to be suspicious on this front. He gives us plenty of reason, but I think has broadly been misunderstood. The concept of breeding here, to return to where I started, is again not strictly heredity, not strictly biological. We think about it in the concept of good breeding, like good manners, right? An aristocratic upbringing, one has it's paired with education. So it's more of a comprehensive concept for Nietzsche that I think is best read continuous with the concept of Bildung in the German tradition, kind of self-cultivation, right?
Well, I want to pick up on something that you said in the course of that description there. As you mentioned, Nietzsche at some point validates the notion of slavery. If we are going to have a society, not only do we need slaves, and maybe another way to say that is we need some form of social subjection so that the sovereigns in society can, create their plan for society, enact those ideals in some way.
Yeah.
Given your politics, which are firmly on the left, influenced by Marx and many others, does the creation of a Marxist society involve some form of necessary social subjection?
I think this is actually one of the most interesting points of connection between Nietzsche and Marx. I actually take this in the opposite direction. It is true that they are going to resolve this dilemma differently, right? Now, I would say whether or not Nietzsche sees a caste society as the ultimate goal, or rather as a transitional stage until sort of all of humanity has transformed into something that can will the eternal return, that I think remains unclear. But what Nietzsche is interested in here is, I think, precisely the same theme that is at the center of Marxism, which is the dialectic of freedom and necessity, right? In Marxism, this question is, how does human labor wrest freedom from the brute necessity of nature, right? How is it that we transform the material world into something that suits our needs, and thus begins this dialectical process of historical development, through which the kind of animating teleology coming out of Hegel is the continued development and richness of human freedom. And for Marx, communist society would be the realization of this, in part because it represents freedom from the kind of alienated labor, the labor to which we are subjected, in favor of some kind of form of labor that is organized. I mean, I think this is an open question. Some people will say that labor is, organized in a sort of consensual, equitable way under a socialist society. Others would go the fully automated luxury communism route and say we need significant automation. But what both of them are getting at is a fundamental challenge here: is how do we deal with all of this necessary work that must be done in society, right? In every human society that we know of in history, there have been large numbers of people who have to do backbreaking manual labor that does not generally allow you to develop your higher faculties, that probably trades off with your ability to realize your real aspirations and dreams in life. And we still exist in a world where that labor for most people is necessary, right? And if Marxism has a promise, it is the one contained in the 1844 manuscripts where he says, I believe that's the site where he says, to criticize in the evening, fish during the day. The idea that being freed from alienated labor, we would be able to cultivate these higher faculties. Both Nietzsche and Marx have this intuition that in order to do that, there has to be freedom from the subjection to labor of certain kinds. Nietzsche's version of this is very ancient Greek, right? So the ancient Greeks had a particular view of slavery. They viewed it as a kind of fact of nature, let's say, something that was, again, necessary so that there would be a free class of individuals who could realize the higher faculties, functions of the polis. But it wasn't, ancient slavery was not like American chattel slavery, right? It was not directed against a particular racial group qua that group. In fact, Aristotle, I think, arguably represents a departure from the rest of the Greek tradition in arguing in favor of natural slavery. I think he is anxious to do so because the Greeks in general see slavery as some terrible fate that befalls you, right? It is something before which all human beings are equal, in a sense. It's not anybody's fault that your city was conquered by the Persians, or Milos conquered by Athens during the Peloponnesian War, right? That's not your fault. It is sort of like a natural disaster, like an earthquake, that you have succumbed to this terrible fate. But Nietzsche inherits this view then from the Greeks, though, that what is essentially valuable about life has to come from freeing yourself in some way from necessary labor. And that applies, I think, that ancient Greek mentality also applies to the kind of money-making accumulation activities of capitalism, right? One way to think about capitalism and the regime of labor under capitalism is that it yokes us even more strongly to this necessity of labor while promising some kind of freedom from alienated labor in the form of free time or vacation or whatever else, right? And to this extent, what Nietzsche is objecting to is not simply democracy for its leveling down inequality. It is also the entire direction of a bourgeois civilization that is only concerned with accumulating capital, and thus with accumulating some kind of mediocre happiness and contentment in this life. So what Marx and Nietzsche share, to kind of sum up what I'm getting at here, is this fundamental question of, on what conditions are something like an affirmative human culture possible, right? Something like a human culture where we actually get to engage in actions that are intrinsically valuable, that are ends in themselves, rather than subjecting ourselves to this kind of necessary labor. For both Marx and Nietzsche, some level of freedom from necessity is required. And they have different stories of how that freedom from necessity is achieved. Maybe on Nietzsche's account, on Nietzsche's perfectionism, it's just a stable feature of societies that some kind of division of caste will be necessary. But it is on this basis, I think, that a synthesis can be had, which is that Nietzsche is describing other conditions that we need to take into account in order to understand how that freedom is possible. And some of those are the conditions of which we have to free ourselves from this civilizational nihilism, and not just class exploitation. We have to free ourselves from this condition of valuelessness that has been imposed by 2 millennia of Christianity.
So if Marxism involves the abolition of the present state of affairs in society,
yes,
and we now have Marx hand in hand with Nietzsche, and we take Nietzsche's premise that the creation of a society or the sustaining of any given society requires some form of social subjection, and we turn that on its head.
Yes.
From an anarchist perspective, we might say something like, well, that's right, societies require social subjection, and that's why we need to do away with society qua society.
Yeah, it opens itself. I think that's precisely the point. It opens itself to those kinds of reversals, which is why, to take anarchism, Emma Goldman considered herself to be a kind of Nietzschean anarchist for similar sorts of reasons. I think that it's likely something that Nietzsche would disagree with. In my personal direction, I'm taking that.
Yeah.
But I don't particularly care. And I don't know that Nietzsche would particularly care either. I mean, I think he insists that people kind of go different directions with this thought. But that is, I think, the site of synthesis. I think, the other point of synthesis would be the kind of critique of religion coming out of Feuerbach. A similar idea of kind of projecting qualities from this world onto some alienating them onto some kind of transcendent realm. I think there are a lot of points of contact there.
Just two more bonus questions to wrap us up. The first is on the question of syphilis in Nietzsche. Nietzsche's philosophical collapse and maybe even the collapse of his mental health is often explained by the fact, or explained away by the claim that he suffered from syphilis. And that's often used to discredit his later work. Is it true that he had syphilis? And what truly happened with Nietzsche's mental health?
Well, as you know, Craig, this is something I've been working on for some time, and I have a sort of ongoing book project that I'm hoping to get back to soon on Nietzsche's madness and its significance for his thought. We can, of course, never know for sure what led to Nietzsche's collapse. However, I do think there are very good reasons to think that he did not have syphilis, as the kind of popular account would suggest. And I do think that while that was the dominant narrative for much of 20th century scholarship, more recent scholarship has now pretty decisively gone away from the syphilis diagnosis. There are a few reasons for this. First of all is that looking at the etiology of sort of Nietzsche's various symptoms. We know that many of Nietzsche's health issues began very early in life, right? His issues with his eyesight, blinding migraine headaches, already present from when he was a child. Mood disorders. We don't see a kind of decisive break in terms of strange kind of mood behavior, only when Nietzsche's would be entering the stage of syphilitic paresis, or the third stage of tertiary syphilis. That would be a sort of decisive break, as it were, into madness, what we supposedly see in January of 1889 in Turin. But really, we see many different kind of unstable mood episodes throughout Nietzsche's life. He's kind of constantly observed by Cosima Wagner, among others. We're concerned that he'll go the way of Hölderlin. We're concerned that he already has this kind of like mental condition. Nietzsche also feared for much of his life that he would go mad as a result of what his father died of, which was diagnosed as softening of the brain. But there are several other issues. One is that other symptoms that are usually associated with syphilis were not observed in Nietzsche. He did not have the canker sores. He didn't have the typical the eye symptoms did not match in terms of where they were located, with where syphilis patients, the issues would be. You also have the fact that he was very rapidly diagnosed when he was checked into Ludwig Villa's clinic in Basel. So Villa specialized in syphilis. At that time, about 2/3 of the patients in his clinic had been diagnosed with syphilis, which is consistent with the rates generally in asylums across Europe at the time. But it's important to remember at the time, syphilis was kind of a social plague. It was sort of, people viewed it as they viewed AIDS maybe in the 80s. It was readily kind of diagnosed without much examination. And particularly, Villa had a misunderstanding from Nietzsche's comment that he had been twice infected, which we know from earlier doctor's notes actually referred to twice being infected with gonorrhea. Another point being he was actually totally willing to come forward with this information previous in his life, right? It would be strange to not admit to it then. And we actually see when later, after Nietzsche's death, the first serological test for syphilis is developed, those rates come down significantly in terms of the diagnosis. So it's almost certainly the case that many of the people who were diagnosed and mentally ill in these asylums in Europe, many of them were diagnosed with syphilis when they did not have it. So I think the sum of evidence for most scholars has pointed towards other explanations. There are a few on offer. There's a inherited disorder called CADASIL, which is kind of neural inflammation disorder, that would potentially explain the symptoms and also potentially link up to his father's death and illness, because it would be inherited. That said, if it were that, Nietzsche did survive for quite a long time for that illness. Actually, same goes for syphilis. Very few people survive for 11 years in the state of syphilitic paresis, an extremely long period of time to survive. So some people do think that it's more likely he had a combination of physical illness, with his intense migraines and myopia and eyesight, combination of that and bipolar disorder, some other psychotic disorder. Personally, I do think this is the most likely explanation. I think it accounts for the full spectrum of his symptoms and makes the best sense of how some of the themes we see coming up in the so-called letters of insanity in that January are continuous with other aspects of his life.
And lastly, the incident with the horse in Turin. It was said that Nietzsche, close to his death or close to his psychotic break, one day ran out in the streets of Turin after seeing a horse being whipped, whereupon he grabs the horse and breaks down in a moment of utter pity and compassion for this animal.
Yes.
Did that actually happen?
Well, let's give a brief timeline here. It's about in late December 1888, where Davide Fino, who's the owner of the boarding house where Nietzsche is staying, starts to get reports of some strange behavior from the apartment upstairs, yelling, playing the piano loudly at odd hours. This continues into the first couple days of January, which is when we know Nietzsche starts writing his letters to Burckhardt, Cosimo Wagner, among others. It's on January 3rd that supposedly this incident with the horse happened, where Nietzsche walks out into the streets of Turin from the boarding house and sees a man relentlessly beating his exhausted horse. And in a final moment of compassion, he throws himself over the horse to protect it, and that is, taken to be the moment of Nietzsche's collapse into insanity. And one thing the horse story does that I think is particularly significant is it gives this clear demarcating boundary, right? This is the point when Nietzsche went mad, right? Prior to this, he was not mad, or maybe not fully. After this, he was irretrievably, irrevocably mad, right? And this is shut down. You see it in Jaspers, you see it in Kaufman. It is shut down exploration of the ways in which that madness actually bleeds into the other texts of 1888, the Antichrist, Ecce Homo. But then I think in addition to that, the question of the horse, so to give the rest of the timeline, Overbeck then traveled down to Turin to kind of check in on his friend, at which point he was transferred to Basel, where he entered Villa's clinic on January 11th. Now, the horse story comes out 11 years later, in 1900, in an Italian newspaper called Nuova Apologia. We would call it a tabloid today. It's not really a reliable newspaper, right? It is from an anonymous article that does not actually cite any firsthand witnesses of this event. So it's very likely that the Turin horse story is apocryphal, was kind of something developed later on and projected back onto whatever happened to Nietzsche and Turin. And we can see one of the reasons why, right? This presents us this convenient picture of the immoralist collapsing in a final moment of pity and compassion. And perhaps we get to conclude Nietzsche really didn't believe all of these immoral things he was saying. Maybe he actually, in his heart, was this, compassionate being, which, maybe he was. But it is one of the ways in which Nietzsche's madness has become an integral part of his legacy, right? Certainly Elizabeth Nietzsche utilized this to promote her own personal fame. You had all of these pilgrims to the Taos in Naumburg, where they would come to see Nietzsche in his room and act as if they were seeing this Buddhist sage sitting there in contemplative silence, as some of the commentators
She
put it.
kind of pulled an Erica Kirk.
Yes, very precisely. Yeah, exactly. A big media tour. And I mean, it is true that was, largely responsible for Nietzsche's writings. Very, very few of his books were read much during his lifetime. But from what we know, it is likely the horse story is apocryphal. There are other weirder accounts, though. So there are some strange things. There is the obvious similarity to Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. Second mention of Crime and Punishment in this episode, where I believe Raskolnikov has a dream of a horse being beaten. Nietzsche refers to this in one of his letters at an earlier point. And you have a particularly wacky hypothesis offered by Claudia Crawford in her book To Nietzsche that plays in this idea of voluntary death in Zarathustra to argue that Nietzsche actually arranged this entire thing as a whole performance, right? This entire insanity was a kind of...
Okay.
I don't buy this thesis. But suffice it to say, the horse story, this idea that maybe it's staged to set up the horse story, right? It adds to the kind of mystique and ambivalence about Nietzsche's kind of descent into madness and its significance. And I do think that's something that still needs to be sketched out, is what I'm trying to kind of work on sketching out at a time where I think we are now seeing, with the rise of mad studies, more and more receptivity towards mad people describing their own experiences from a first personal standpoint as having meaningful content. And I want to see what that can bring to this puzzling question of the status of Nietzsche's madness in relation to his philosophy.
All right. Well, just wrapping up here, your podcast is Moral Minority. I know you have some projects going on. Let's finish up talking about those.
Yeah, sure. Moral Minority, we're a philosophy podcast mostly focusing on ethics and moral philosophy, but from a left kind of radical orientation, trying to see how these moral frameworks, why they might be important for radical emancipatory politics today. But we have a few things coming up. We should be releasing an episode on Simone Weil soon, but after that, we're going to be exploring a couple things. We've got an episode with Jonathan Fine coming up in January on Lessing's Nathan the Wise and Hannah Arendt, and James Crane from the Critical Theory Working Group. We are working on scheduling an episode for February on the translations he's been doing of Adorno and Horkheimer. And we also have an episode, our own kind of episode, not a guest episode, on Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex of the Horse. So a lot of stuff on the horizon, some guests as well as some of our own kind of diving into big texts episodes.
All right. Well, thanks for getting breakfast with me today.
Yeah, thanks for visiting me in Monroe, and I hope everybody enjoyed some myth busting when it comes to Nietzsche.